Hi guys, this is Mighty Mr. Mustache, and this is a response to Shad's video from Shadiversity on the Lord of the Rings castles. Now Shad, I'm a big fan, but you didn't do your research on this one. For anyone who's watching this and feels like commenting, I'm not bashing Shad or Shadiversity in any way. I love the content they create, and you should absolutely go check his stuff out. It's great. So when I saw something from him that I thought wasn't up to his usual standard, I felt it was important to respond. Also, this is just about some Lord of the Rings background stuff. Let's not get crazy. It's just nerd nitpicking, and it is all in fun. A few months ago, Shad produced a video where he rated the reality and effectiveness of three key locations in the Lord of the Rings. These were Edoras, Minas Tirith, and Helm's Deep. And while some of the points Shad made concerning the design and usefulness of those places make some sense from his point of view, he pretty much mislabeled the function of each of these places. You've made some assumptions in your review, Shad, that just aren't supported by the story. And those assumptions lead you to judge the locations incorrectly, even if your points might make sense if they're built to fit the role you've assigned them. So firstly, let's take a look at Edoras. You certainly aren't wrong when you said that Edoras wasn't a big enough city or well defended enough, or that it lacked any sort of farming in its immediate area. All of those statements are absolutely true, but it is also the way Edoras was built to be. The nation of Rohan doesn't have any cities, and Edoras is not a city. It's a small, lightly defended stronghold that serves as the home of the king, his immediate family, and a standing guard of about 200 men, with their families. The standing army of Rohan was in general very small. Everybody was out doing their own thing, raising horses and farming. It was more of an honor guard and a police force who patrolled the borders of Rohan, keeping out bands of bandits or maybe orcs. Peace had reigned with the men of Dunland to the west for a long time, even if they didn't really get along. And at the western border, mountains blocked any easy access for invasion, making the only western access the Gap of Rohan, and they thought that was safe in the hands of Saruman at his stronghold of Isengard. Right up until the attack by Saruman's forces, the Rohirrim were convinced he was their most powerful ally, and no one west of Isengard could muster a large enough force to overcome him and push through the gap. Edoras itself was never intended to house large numbers of people, and the lands around it were used pretty much for the purpose of grazing the king's herds of horses. Supplies were brought in from villages not too far away. It was also never intended to be defended. At that time, the Rohirrim, if there was ever a war, would send their vulnerable population to Helm's Deep to shelter and wait, while the army took to the field. In that regard, Edoras wasn't built to last, but rather it was built to be reasonably comfortable and not present much of a target to an invading force. Rohan's army relied on mobility. Literally every soldier was a cavalryman. The countryside played into this, and it was all flat prairie. Even so, the walls of Edoras certainly could have been built better, and Shad, you're correct in your statement that a normal medieval kingdom would have hired masons to come and build for them if they lacked the technology themselves, which the Rohirrim certainly did. In the two key regions who could have accomplished this, namely Rohan and Gondor, no one, literally no one was around who had those skills anymore, and there wasn't even enough of a population to manage the foraying and manpower needed to get that work done, even if they could. The entire world at that time, at least as far as humanity was concerned, was slowly recovering from a devastating plague that had decimated the population a couple of hundred years earlier. On top of that, the technological superpower of the world was Gondor at that time, and they were in a steep population decline. In the centuries following the founding of Gondor and Rohan, the people who had accomplished the building of places like Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith had been dying out. If you were to locate the Lord of the Rings on a timeline that corresponded to history, at least our history, it'd be much closer to the earliest days of the medieval period in the real dark ages when Rome had fallen and most of its technology had been lost. And this is the second point here that I want to make. Shad, you weren't wrong when you said Edoras didn't look like a capital of a place with a big enough population to support the army that showed up at the Battle of Minas Tirith. And once again, you're right, but you're also wrong. The men of Rohan kept a small standing army at most times, but they could muster an extremely large force of well-trained cavalry at almost a moment's notice. Almost every man of fighting age was capable of going off to fight and could be counted on to answer the king's call in time of war. It's said that the army of about 7,000 men that arrived at the Battle of Minas Tirith was almost the entire possible force that Rohan could manage. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble that stripped Rohan of almost every man of fighting age. So Rohan had only one strong defensible keep, Helm's Deep, and it was almost never used, except as a place for the most vulnerable to hide, while Rohan's mobile army of cavalry met any enemy out in the field. They would ride around, they would drag them from place to place, they would use their cavalry mobility to get the upper hand, and they would rely on Gondor to come in and support them. This takes us to Helm's Deep, and a picture of Helm's Deep will pop up in a moment. In this point, again, Shad, you're not really wrong. It's only a mediocre stronghold. It's a failing of Rohan's that they lacked the ability to improve it themselves, and they had an inherent distrust of anyone who could have improved the quality of Helm's Deep, like, let's say, the dwarves. And again, among the human populations that could have worked to make improvements to the Deep in Coom, no one had the manpower or skill anymore. It was, as it stood, stronger than anything they could build on their own, and no one so far had ever been able to defeat it if it was defended by a decent enough force. So it was good enough. Seeing as the threat was always seen to be coming from the east, from Mordor, the location of Helm's Deep, which was far in the west of Rohan, within a few days' ride of Isengard, made it good enough for the nation of Rohan to feel confident in their ability to hold it as a last stand. Any army of orcs would have had to fight its way down the entire length of Rohan, battling in the field against the Rohirrim, with the threat of Gondor coming in behind them at any moment. And so any force that made it to Helm's Deep would have come very far, fought every step of the way, and would then face a strong and well-defended last stand with the threat of Saruman just by. So while Shad, you might be right that Helm's Deep was not a great stronghold, it was never really a concern of Rohan's that it would need to be improved. It had done the job in the past, and it didn't fail so much as Rohan failed to see the threat coming from the west. Even then, it took a pretty big deus ex machina to bring down Helm's Deep. In conclusion, at least as far as Rohan's concerned, Edoras was never a city. More likely, it could be considered a gated compound for the king and his family and their personal guard. The Rohirrim had no idea of how to fight from a strongly defended position. They relied on mobility and a proportionally huge army to their population. It also never really needed to do anything else. War is a great motivator for technological advancement, but Rohan had not spent much time at war. They had never had to improve the way they did things. Gondor defended them from Mordor, and their biggest threat was small bands of brigands and bandits in their land. Edoras and Helm's Deep are just perfect examples of a complacent population who didn't have the capacity to do much better anyway. From here we move on to Minas Tirith, the mighty fortress tower built into the very last peak of the White Mountains. Once again, Shad is both right and wrong in his view that it's not practical as a capital city. It isn't practical, you're right, but it isn't a capital city. The capital of Gondor is the large island city of Osgiliath. It sits in the middle of the River Anduin and is about as big as my home island of Montreal, Canada, or maybe the island of Manhattan. At its height, it was probably a parallel to the city of Rome. And in the earliest days of Gondor, when they had a huge population and the time and skill to make the buildings, Minas Tirith was just a guard outpost, albeit one so massive and imposing that it could almost be called a city. Now, Shad, you mentioned there's no fields of grain or farmlands around the walls, but those stone walls are in fact the second line of defense. At about a mile from the walls, in a semicircle, is a second defensive wall or berm, making the flat open land in front of Minas Tirith into a sort of champ de mars or battleground. And it might be in the books. I couldn't find it again, but it may still be there that it could be flooded in time of war, given enough time and manpower. All that open ground, at its height, Gondor boasted an army large enough to defend a couple of miles of outer dike, and had the open ground between to allow easy maneuvers and a fighting retreat if necessary. At the time, defense was against much less advanced people, and no real threat to Gondor even existed. In The Return of the King, there's a scene where the Rohirrim arrive at the battle, and they go over a sort of ridge, and that's the outer defensive dike leading to the battle on the open ground in front of the stone walls. It's called the Pelennor, and before the big battle, many soldiers of Gondor complain that they feel terrible in giving up the Pelennor without a fight. As for the practicality of Minas Tirith itself, the levels were built with good roads leading up to each with a switchback, allowing wagons to be drawn up and down without trouble, and a gate at each of the 7 levels made each one a defended fortress in its own right. As a military stronghold, much like a modern army base, it was nearly impregnable and provided comfort, for its defenders and for their families. It was the plague and the decline in the intellectual and artisanal capacity of Gondor that led to them using Minas Tirith as the last of their defended cities. Gondor couldn't hold the east side of the river, where their realm pushed up against Mordor, and they lost the twin tower to Minas Tirith, which was called Minas Ithil. Then they were pushed from the capital of Osgiliath because they lacked the manpower to defend it effectively, and so they moved the seat of government to Minas Tirith, which wasn't perfect but was the best choice under the circumstances. Behind Minas Tirith was still 1,000 miles of Gondor to retreat into, and with allies to fall back upon, and a coastline to the south that would allow a force to sneak in behind an invader. Minas Tirith was a powerful and nigh invincible stronghold that an enemy from the east would have to completely conquer in order to gain access to the vulnerable lands of the west. It wasn't a glorious capital city that happened to be well defended, and it was never meant to be. So, Shad, the human kingdoms of the Lord of the Rings were very much like medieval ones, but more in the sense that they were clinging to the last of the technological marvels of a greater, earlier age like the Roman Empire, having lost the techniques to make their own concrete of the things that were common 500 years earlier. I want to thank everybody for listening. I have been Mighty Mr. Mustache, the mightiest mustache in the universe. Go check out Shadiversity. You won't be disappointed. And Shad, I just wanted to point out something that I thought you could have done better on. Thanks a lot.